So this lecture is going to be divided into two different parts. The first is a broad overview of what Engels is talking about when he talks about the dialectics of nature. And the second part is going to get more into the specificity of how nature operates in a dialectical way. I want you to keep in mind the previous lecture in which Hegel lays out this grand vision of dialectics as the laws of change that impact thought, that impact nature, and that impact history. They determine these things. Hegel primarily views these as laws of thought. In other words, abstract laws of thought on the basis of which history, philosophy, and nature unfold themselves, unfurl themselves. But Engels and Marx take a very different view. Now, to understand the dialectics of nature, the first thing you have to understand is what were the thought processes of people, especially scientists and scholars and theologians and others in the medieval period. They thought of the world and nature in particular as being immutable, stable, and harmonious. These are the qualities they ascribed to it. Why did they think that the world was immutable, stable, harmonious, etc.? They thought that the world was governed by divine order, and there was a fixed hierarchy of elements, all the things that the world is composed of, as well as a fixed hierarchy of beings, with man at the top and other beings, etc., under that. And also inanimate matter to humans and celestial beings, etc., the stars, everything you saw in the night sky, the moon, all of these things in their view were immutable. God had created them and they had always existed. This idea was in part taken from Aristotle, for whom everything was defined by its final cause. Everything had a purpose. Everything was created for a purpose. This final cause, this purpose for which everything was created, for which every particular thing is created, is referred to as teleos. And this particular way of looking at the universe or at the world or at nature is referred to as teleology. Okay? So the teleological view of nature was exactly this, that everything in nature serves a purpose and it's designed, it's created in order to serve that particular purpose. Of course, Aristotle was writing at a time when Christianity had not yet come about. But Christianity also took up Aristotelian thought and then kind of synthesized it with Christian thought, creating Thomism, which is the thought of Thomas Aquinas, which became pretty much standard thought for the church after Aquinas' writing. So in this view, God's eternal and unchangeable will was reflected in nature. And so nature itself had to be unchangeable, immutable, absolutely stable, unchanging, and so on. Aquinas believed that the laws of nature were divinely ordained, meaning that while individual natural events could change, the overarching order of the cosmos was fixed, it was immutable, and it reflected God's perfect wisdom. Think of it this way, that for the ancient Greeks, knowledge, perfect knowledge, absolute knowledge was something that was unchangeable, unchanging, timeless, and so on. Independent of time, independent of space, independent of matter, independent of circumstances. That's how they thought, that's what they thought about God's divine reflection. And God's divine reflection was the material, secular world that we see. And since divine knowledge had to be timeless and perfect and so on, hence the world created on the order of that timeless divine plan had to itself be also immutable and stable. There was a fixed hierarchy reflecting the divine order. Medieval scholars, in fact, talked about the great chain of being, that there was a chain of animals from the lower to the higher order, etc., a kind of ladder of creation, the lowest creation to the highest creation. And the highest creation was man. And that ladder was fixed, it was immutable, it did not change. And that similarly, there was a structure to everything from minerals to angels, the smallest item to the biggest thing. There was a hierarchy here that was immutable, unchangeable. It was ordained by divine will. And the natural world reflected the divine mind. So natural laws, such as the motion of the planets or the behavior of the animals, were seen as part of the stable order with little room for variability. The apparent stability and regularity in natural phenomena like the changing of the seasons, the phases of the moon, etc., was seen as evidence of God's consistent governance. This is also found in Muslim philosophy, by the way. If you look at Al-Ghazali, for example, he also says that the reason why you find consistency in the universe is because God's will is consistent. But God can, if God wants to, change his view and therefore change all the laws of physics. But it's just the case that he doesn't, because there is a divine plan, there is a divine wisdom, there is divine providence, and everything is based in matter is based on that, and hence everything in matter is immutable. What a strange idea. I think you will probably say to yourself, this is a very strange idea, right? But it was considered pretty much the normal idea until natural science and Hegel and philosophy slowly eroded this idea. So this lecture is actually the story about how this idea of nature being immutable, nature being unchanging, nature being harmonious is overthrown with the idea that nature in fact can be chaotic. Nature, rather than being harmonious, is in contradiction. There's fights going on and chaos and struggles going on, etc. And rather than being stable, it's actually very unstable and is constantly evolving and changing. This is a completely different idea and it required a big change. Darwinism is very much only one part of this larger change in the way in which humanity saw nature. So in the medieval period, they saw it basically as stable, and in the post-medieval period, in the modern period, they see nature as essentially always changing. Engels writes, what especially characterizes this period, that is the medieval period, is the elaboration of a peculiar general outlook. They had a very strange and a particular general outlook in which the central point is the view of the absolute immutability of nature. This is very important for us to understand. This extends to everything. It extends to species, elements, it extends to plants, it extends to the continents, the stars in the sky. Everything is created according to a divine plan, and hence it is immutable. In that plan, there is nothing in the way of things changing. It's just that's the structure, hierarchy created by God. Okay? Now, modern natural science began to challenge this central idea of the immutability of nature. So, he says that Renaissance ke baad ke period mein, there's a whole scientific revolution that erupts in Europe. And modern science, which he says dates from the late 15th century in particular, begins to change this idea of the immutability of nature. He says we can date that from the period, it really doesn't begin then, but it begins soon afterwards from what is referred to sometimes as the Reformation, sometimes it is referred to by the French as the Renaissance, and by the Italians as the Cinquecento, etc. In other words, there's this change coming about in the way in which humanity and scholars are viewing nature. And it rapidly escalates from the 15th century onwards. This is a period in which modern bourgeois society, in other words, modern capitalist society, is also being created. Royalty, with the support of the burghers of the town. Who are the burghers? Burghers are basically the traders that came out of the peasantries. Broke the power of the feudal nobility and established the great monarchies based essentially on nationality, within which the modern European nations and modern bourgeois societies came to development. In other words, what happened was that the traders, the merchants, the East India Company type of folks, etc., they wanted to get political power. So how did they get political power? They somehow or the other managed to maneuver in such a way that the king would support the trading class and not side with the nobility against the trading class. This was also referred to as a period of absolute monarchy. So the absolute monarchists of this particular period were basically people who were very strongly pro the trading class. And the biggest example of that is this guy over here, who is Henry VIII, who even married somebody from the trading class, which is Anne Boleyn, right? So that tells you the power of the traders, etc. Similarly, in Germany, the peasant wars were going on, and they pointed prophetically to future class struggles in the beginning of the modern proletariat, with the red flag in their hands and the demand for common ownership of goods on their lips, etc. So in Germany, we have the Reformation, We have the Protestant Reformation going on. So this is also a period of political change is happening as well as intellectual change. The Renaissance and the period that comes after it, he considers to be one of the greatest, most progressive revolutions that mankind has so far seen. So unlike many postmodernists who continue to tell you that enlightenment badi buri cheez thi, like Foucault, Derrida and others like that, Marx and Engels don't think that is at all. In fact, their opinion is exactly the opposite. This was amazing. What happened post the Renaissance through the Enlightenment was a great revolution that mankind experienced, and without it, we would have been stuck in the medieval period. How did this happen? Manuscripts from the fall of Byzantium, antique statues dug out of the ruins of Rome, a new world was revealed to the astonished West, that of ancient Greece. Suddenly, the Italians discovered their Roman heritage, their Greek heritage, and they were like, wow, this is absolutely amazing. We want to know much more about this, and so on. And over time, although this was first encouraged by the church, over time, this broke the dictatorship of the church over men's mind. That was shattered. So the church was the institution where every pada likha banda of Europe used to exist. I mean, outside of the church, there were rarely anybody who could read or write. Even the princes and kings, they could not read or write. The only people who could read or write were the monks and the priests and the fathers and so on. That is where all the knowledge was focused and concentrated. And so not only did they have knowledge of religious matters, that was the institution where scientific, artistic, philosophical knowledge really was centered. So that was the state really of Europe at the time. So really the church had this kind of monopoly on the intellectual production of Europe. And for that reason, it dominated over the minds of everybody in the sense that they were the ones who were really doing all the intellectual work. But now the Renaissance broke that monopoly. Germans adopted Protestantism. The Latins adopted free thought taken over from the Arabs. From the Muslims? Really? They adopted free thought from us? This is so weird. It's not so weird if you think about the fact that he's principally referring to Ibn Rushd. Ibn Rushd is very much responsible for creating the foundation or laying some of the foundational ideas of the European Renaissance. In fact, there was a whole school of Christian thinkers who were Christian in their religion, but they used to follow Ibn Rushd in their philosophy. And nourished by the newly discovered Greek philosophy, it prepared the way for the materialism of the 18th century. So materialism as a doctrine really comes about in the Enlightenment period, but the Renaissance already starts the process of this scientific revolution, which is going to change people's opinions, minds, and so on as time goes on. And this is great, he says. At this time, you have what is called the Renaissance man, or Renaissance woman, which was more rare, but nonetheless present. They pursue their lives in the midst of practical struggles. So for them, these are not just academic questions. This was about real struggles against real enemies, etc., real opponents, etc. There was the powerful Catholic Church, and here were the scientists who were saying Galileo is right, or Flana is right, etc. These were all practical people. And they traveled extensively. They love to travel. But when we travel, we don't actually want to experience something different from what we are used to. We travel mostly, okay, we're going to go and we're going to work, etc., and then we're going to come back. When we travel, we're only going to meet other Pakistanis, and okay, at the best, we'll meet some Indians, etc., because they're a lot like us. But the Renaissance traveler was somebody who wanted to know about alien cultures, different societies. So in this period, they used to write all these travelogues about India, about China, about Africa, about all the crazy places they've been to, and all the different people they've met and their different traditions. And these were very popular in Europe. People used to read them and go, do you know that the Chinese don't believe in God? They are like an atheist people. They believe in Confucianism, which is just a philosophy, but they don't have any, they believe in ancestors, etc. But they don't believe in an overarching deity, etc. It just shocked people when they discovered that the Chinese didn't really have the same kind of concept of God as Christianity or Islam. It really shocked people, right? So these were the kinds of things that they loved to read about. It opened their minds in a big way. And then you had people like Leonardo da Vinci, who was a painter, mathematician, mechanic, engineer, physicist, etc. Albert Dürer, engraver, sculptor, architect, invented a system of fortification. Machiavelli, who was a statesman, historian, poet, notable military author. You had Luther, who criticized the church, created modern German prose, composed music. You had Taimur Rahman, he had the Lal band, and he used to teach. And oh no, sorry, he wasn't there, etc. You see, they were not people who said, oh, this is my speciality, I'm going to learn about post-Hegelian philosophy only in the 18th century, and that too in Germany. No, they were people who had broad knowledge. And by the way, it's from here that you get the idea that you see so frequently taught in universities. Okay, you have to have broad knowledge. You know how you have these out groups and in groups, and you're forced to take things that you don't really want to take, etc. It's from here that you get that idea. Because when you had broad knowledge, you were able to make cross-disciplinary connections and say, well, this is happening in geology, and that's happening in philosophy, and that's happening in history, and bring it all together and look at what you get. And it's very creative to do that. It stimulates the mind. Except, of course, if you're only doing it for grades, in which case it doesn't do anything. So these were practical, real struggles, not academic sort of things, and so on. They used to take sides. They used to join in the fight, one by speaking and writing, another with the sword, many with both, hence the fullness and force of character that makes them complete men. In other words, for them, this was not some one-sided thing. This was, we are going to change. They were like revolutionaries of their period. We're going to change society. We want to learn as much as possible. We want to learn about everything. It's not like I just want to learn about science. I want to learn about science and art and philosophy and history and everything. Everything. That which is human is not alien to me was one of the great slogans of this period. I want to learn everything that concerns me as a human being. Natural science also developed in the midst of this general revolution. And science was also revolutionary. Now we can't really feel that anymore because it's so, when you're, at this time, science, art, philosophy, all of this felt fresh and alive and revolutionary. It's changing the world. This was, they had real martyrs, people who were killed in this struggle for the beliefs that they held. And it was not just the Catholics who did it, the Protestants did it as well. So the Protestants outdid Catholics in persecuting modern science. Calvin had Servetus burnt at the stake when the latter was on the point of discovering the circulation of the blood. And indeed, he kept him roasting alive during 2 hours. For the Inquisition, at least it sufficed to have Giordano Bruno simply burnt alive. This guy, he was roasted for suggesting the circulation of blood. And he was right. So having those kind of views even back in the day could get you into so much trouble. Anatomy was considered to be totally something that religious people it was a taboo for religious people. You know why? Because they said the body is going to be resurrected in heaven. You can't cut it up. If you cut it up, it will be cut up in heaven as well. So you have to preserve it carefully. Of course, God can heal a body. It's not difficult for God. But anyway, they thought that. So anatomy was considered really bad. When Da Vinci and Michelangelo and others, when they did the hand, etc., which they studied the veins, the muscles, the bones of the hand, and they would go to the places where they would find people who had died, etc. And then they would cut the flesh to see how the bones and the muscles are created, just so that they could be good artists. When they depicted it, they would know what the bone structure and muscle structure inside the hand was, so that they could depict it in stone, etc. Isn't that amazing? That's the crazy extent to which these artists used to go to. Okay, so, and then of course the big revolution comes about. It starts in astronomy, really. If you want to know more about it, watch Cosmos by Carl Sagan, or its remake by Neil deGrasse, Cosmos. Beautiful series that talks about how science was revolutionary at this time, and it changed the way people thought. Began with this guy here, Nicholas Copernicus, and he was the first to suggest that, look, the universe is not centered around the earth. That's wrong. In fact, the universe is much bigger, and we are moving around the sun. Today, that sounds insane that the church would have, fought that idea. But think about it from the church's perspective as well. No, they thought that there is an earth at the center, and everything else revolves around the earth, because that is the way it appears to us if you look at the sky. If you look at the sky, it doesn't appear to us like you're moving, right? It appears to you like everything else is moving. You're stable. And literally it appears to you like everything is moving around you. You really look at the night sky, you feel like you're at the center. It takes a great power of abstraction to see that that what is your senses are showing you is in fact not necessarily accurate. It takes enormous power of mental abstraction to be able to see that. The first person to be able to see that, actually the Greeks also saw it, but in the medieval period it was Copernicus who revolutionized. And he was so terrified that when he wrote this book, The Revolution of the Heavenly Spheres, he didn't want it published because he was like, they're going to kill me. The church is going to absolutely burn me alive. So he said, okay, I'm going to keep the book. He locked it up in a safe, and then he gave the chabi or whatever to his rishtedars. And when he was on his deathbed, he said, when I die, you can publish it. And that's what happened. When he died, they published it because he was so scared of what the church would do to him. Antiquity had bequeathed Euclid and the Ptolemaic solar system. The Arabs had left behind the decimal notation, the beginnings of algebra, the modern numerals and alchemy. And the Christian Middle Ages, what did they leave? Nothing at all. These are the contributions made by others. Do you know what this is? This is the numerical system. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. You recognize that, right? But what you won't recognize is, well, 1 is pretty much always 1 like that. But 2, which we write over here, if you just change it, 2, you see that that's Urdu 3, that's how they were used, 4, etc., and so on. So this is just the same 2. Look, this is like this, and if I just turn it around, this is the same 2, but it's written upwards like that. You see that? So this was the Indian writing system that the Arabs learned from us. Okay? They took it from us, and then the Europeans took it from the Arabs. So the Europeans refer to it as the Arab writing system, and the Arabs refer to it as the Hindu writing system or Indian writing system. Hai na mazedar baat? And by the way, let me tell you one more interesting thing, which is that we were the first people to invent this little thing here, which is the zero, the concept of the zero, numerical zero, which of course is very important to be able to write numbers in this particular way. So you know how the Europeans used to write numbers? No, they used to just make sticks like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I'm not joking. That's how they used to write. Then they took 5 sticks and they made one V out of it. They took 10 sticks and they made an X out of it, etc. But that's basically how they wrote. Okay, so the first big breakthroughs came in astronomy. The most fundamental natural science, the mechanics of terrestrial and heavenly bodies occupied first place. And alongside of it, as a handmaiden to it, the discovery and perfecting of mathematical methods, which was done by this guy, whose name is Johannes Kepler, who figured out that the orbit was not circular, but actually was a kind of ellipse, etc. The basic features of the most essential mathematical methods were established: analytical geometry by Descartes especially, logarithms by Napier, and the differential and integral calculus by Leibniz and also Newton. Kepler discovered the laws of planetary movement, and Newton formulated them from the point of view of the general laws of motion of matter. And this was a huge revolution in the way in which people were thinking about the stars and planets. But there was a problem. High as the natural science of the first half of the 18th century stood above the Greek antiquity and knowledge, and even in the sifting of its material. So they knew more, but there was a problem. It stood just as deeply below Greek antiquity in the theoretical mastery of this material. Their theory had not caught up with all their empirical work. In the general outlook on nature, their general outlook on nature still was the medieval outlook on nature, despite the fact that they had discovered all these new things about nature. What was that? Science was still deeply enmeshed in theology. Science had to escape from that metaphysical theological view about the immutability of nature. For Greek philosophers, the world was essentially emerged from chaos. But for the scientists of that period, nature was ossified, something immutable, and for most of them, something that had to be created at one stroke. Everything in nature just came like that by God, etc. Everything came instantaneously. Nothing new was created. No new species came into being. No new plants came into being. No new continents could come into being. No new elements could be created. No, it just had to come into being in one instant. That's how they viewed it. Everywhere it sought and found its ultimate resort in an impulse from outside that was not to be explained from nature itself. In every instance, they would find, okay, how did the solar system come into being? It was created by God. End of story, etc. There was no examination of how gaseous clouds could have come together and revolved and so on, its own evolution, etc. So this was a major issue. Science still held on to the idea of the absolute immutability of nature. For example, planets and their satellites, once set in motion by the mysterious first impulse, circled on and on in their destined ellipses for all eternity. Okay? The planets, the stars, they're just going to go round and round like that for all eternity. They're neither created nor will they die. Stars remain fixed and immovable in their place, keeping one another therein by universal gravitation. Stars are also fixed. The earth had persisted without alteration from all eternity. The continents, etc., the way they are, they've always been like that, and so on. The way the earth is always been like that, and so on. The way the 5 continents are had always existed, and they had always had the same mountains, the same valleys, the same rivers, the same climate, and the same flora and fauna, except insofar as change or cultivation had taken place at the hand of man. Okay, so nature was immutable. The species of plants and animals had also been established once and for all and could not change. Now, logical consistency of thought is the only thing that could overcome this defective knowledge. And this is where philosophy plays a key role for science. Philosophers play the key role in the further development of science, because philosophers were also reading the scientists, and they are the first ones to say, if all of what you're saying is true about the natural world, then our philosophical view about the natural world, especially with respect to its immutability, has to change. He writes, it is to the highest credit of the philosophy of the time that it did not let itself be led astray by the restricted state of contemporary natural knowledge, and that from Spinoza right to the great French materialists, it insisted on explaining the world from the world itself and left the justification in detail to the natural science of the future. So they didn't have all the evidence back when Spinoza was writing. But from little bits of evidence, they came to the conclusion that this idea of the absolute immutability of the universe was wrong, and that things were in motion and in change. Perhaps the first great shot in this regard was fired by Immanuel Kant, who wrote this book, The General Nature of History and Theory of the Heavens. What did he say in this? He says the first impulse is totally wrong, this idea that there was a first impulse and then the world was created like this, etc. In fact, the whole solar system was explained as something that had come into being. The solar system has its own history and evolution. It doesn't just come into being in one instant by God's command. It evolves in time, says Immanuel Kant. If the earth was something that had come into being, then its present geological, geographical, and climatic state, and its plants and animals likewise, must be something that had come into being. It must have had a history, not only of coexistence in space, but also of succession in time. Laplace and Herschel expounded Kant's philosophy in science. So he gave this idea initially that all of this has evolved. It did not come into being in one instant. It has a history of creation. But he didn't know scientifically how to prove that. Other scientists came later, much later, and began to prove it and prove it and prove it. But philosophically, he had come to that conclusion. The first big break was made by geology. This is not made by people who were against religion or anything of that sort. In fact, they were themselves priests and so on. Geology points out not only the terrestrial strata formed one after another and deposited one upon another, but also the shells and skeletons of extinct animals and the trunks, leaves, and fruits of no longer existing plants contained in these strata were discovered. This was a big shock, that they were animals that they found in the layers of the earth that no longer existed. They were extinct animals. And they thought to themselves that they had believed for such a long time that nature was immutable. All the species that had existed had been created by God and would live forever. But now suddenly they discovered that there are a whole bunch of these species that don't live anymore. We don't find them anymore in nature. And secondly, they began to think about how these layers of the earth, and they began to date them and try to understand them. Now at that time, the church thought that the world was maybe 6,000, 4,000, 6,000, 6,500 years old. But Lyell was the first one to say that the earth must be much, much older than that. Much, much older than that. How did he come to that conclusion? He began to really look at these things, and he began to say, okay, look, what's happening is that the earth's layers, the whole soil of the earth, in a certain sense, is in slow movement. It's almost like we are living upon this volcano, the crust of which is constantly always cooling off. We're sitting on the cool part of this volcano, but it's constantly in motion. And that's how you get all these volcanic eruptions, and you get new things coming up from under the earth. They come to the fore, and the old things from the earth go down. You get layers and layers of that, and you can actually begin to not only date these layers, you can also begin to date the plants and the fossils of the plants and animals that you find there, and you can create a chart of them. And this was done all before Darwin's time. Okay, so Cuvier said in place of a single divine creation, he had the idea of a whole series of repeated acts of creation. He said God doesn't just create once, tuck, all the animals are created and plants are created. No, maybe God creates and then he creates again and then he creates again. Why? Because we're seeing new things coming out in the fossil record that don't exist over here but exist over here. And we see things that are dying out, that exist over there but don't exist over here. What's going on? So clearly life is changing. We're seeing that. So maybe God is recreating these things. And Lyell first brought sense into geology by substituting for the sudden revolutions due to the mood of the creator, the gradual effects of a slow transformation of the earth. So the earth itself is changing and transforming. Then the next big change came in the 19th century, and this came in physics. And the change was that now people began to demonstrate, firstly, Mayer and Joule, that heat can be converted into mechanical energy, and mechanical energy can be converted into heat. All of this we study in 5th grade. Back in the 19th century, this was not 5th grade physics. This was cutting edge physics. Groove proved that physical energy, mechanical energy, heat, light, electricity, magnetism, chemical energy can all be transformed into each other without any loss of energy. Hence, he proved Descartes' principle that the quantity of motion present in the world is constant. Descartes had already come to this conclusion. He couldn't prove it scientifically. Matter and energy can neither be created nor destroyed. You've read this, again, in 5th level physics, but here it is. Physical energies could be transformed into each other under definite laws. This proved that the idea of the immutability of physical energies was also wrong. So, Pele immutability, of the stars and planets, etc., that's being challenged, and now about energies is also being challenged. Then, in chemistry, similar changes began to happen. Lavoisier and Dalton created organic substances from inorganic compounds. And now it's, you can create proteins, etc. in a lab. It's not hard, in a beaker. And bridge the gulf between inorganic and organic nature. Hence, the immutability of organic and inorganic substances also was challenged. You can turn one into the other. Okay? Not hard to do at all. And now in biology, the same change began to happen. New research began to show that separate species of plants and animals become more and more inextricably intermingled. Okay, you can see that they are intermingled, etc. You began to see commonalities between them. Animals turned up such as, Amphoxus and Lepidosiren, I can't say the words correctly, etc. That made a mockery of all previous classifications. New kind of animals are being discovered. Organisms were encountered which was not possible to say whether they belong to the plant or the animal kingdom. You don't know whether it's a plant or an animal. What do you say about it? It's kind of in between both of these things. So then C.F. Wolf in 1759 began to say that there has to be, he began to challenge the idea of the immutability and fixity of species. An idea held in medieval times, thanks to Aristotle and St. Thomas Aquinas, etc. But now being challenged, no, these things are not fixed. In fact, they always transform, they change. Then comes Oken and Lamarck and Baer, and finally Darwin in 1959, who talks about the origin of species. He's not talking about the origin of life. He's not even talking about the origin of man, apes turning into man, etc. He's just attacking one particular very important thesis, and that thesis is the immutability of species. He's saying they are mutable, they change, they mutate, and they're doing it constantly. Nature was now seen as being in a cycle, in a flux, in constant change. So science in that sense returned to Greek philosophy. He says we have returned once again to the ancient Greek philosophy, but there's a difference. The Greeks didn't have all this knowledge about how energies can be transformed into other energies. The Greeks didn't have this knowledge about how species were not immutable. The Greeks didn't have this knowledge about the stars and the planets and their orbits and so on and so forth. They didn't have this knowledge or understanding about the fact that the earth itself has layers upon layers that are coming out of the sea all the time or the oceans all the time. We have all that knowledge, and we've returned to the idea of the Greeks that everything is in flux, everything is changing. There's no immutable thing in this world, in nature. Everything in nature is constantly, given time, constantly changing. And so we come to the idea of the evolution of life, we come to the idea of the evolution of matter, and we also come to the idea of the evolution of history of humanity itself, how humanity has itself gone through change. Animals, he says, have a history, but history is done to animals. They are not conscious of what they do. Human beings, insofar as they move away from animals, they become conscious of how they can change their own history. We make our own history, in other words. If we apply this measure to human history, we find that there still exists a colossal disproportion between the proposed aims and the results arrived at. The proposed aims are we want to create a society of liberty, equality, fraternity. But when we create that society, something else happens, right? The proposed aim, we're going to create Pakistan and everybody is going to be equal because we're all going to be Muslims. But then we create Pakistan and we discover Muslims are killing Muslims. Why does this happen all the time to us in politics, in history, in economics? Why does it feel like human history, although we are determining it, but it feels like human history is not really being determined by humans. It feels like it's being determined by some other force, because whatever we want to do with it doesn't end up happening. Something else ends up happening, etc. Why is this the case? He says, take an example. In advanced industrial countries, we have multiplied production so that a child now produces more than 100 adults could in the past. What is the result? Increased overwork, increasing misery of the masses. Every 10 years, a great collapse. Darwin did not know what a bitter satire he wrote when he talked about, the competition of the species and survival of the fittest. We see that every day in the stock market. Only conscious organization of social production, he says, in which production and distribution are carried on in a planned way, can lift mankind above the rest of the animal world as regards the social aspect, in the same way that production in general has done this for men in the aspect as a species. We have gone above the animal level in terms of production. We can produce what animals cannot produce. But in terms of social production, no. In terms of the social effects of our production, no. There's no plan there. That's chaotic. That's capitalism for you. So historical evolution makes such an organization daily more indispensable, and it will come about, and that is what he wants. So in sum, all that comes into being deserves to perish. Everything that exists will come to an end. And from this, just logically, he comes to the conclusion. He says millions of years may elapse, hundreds of thousands of generations be born and die, but inexorably the time will come when the declining warmth of the sun will no longer suffice to melt the ice thrusting itself forward from the poles. When the human race crowding more and more about the equator will finally no longer find even there enough heat for life. When gradually even the last trace of organic life will vanish and the earth, an extinct, frozen globe like the moon, will circle in deepest darkness in an ever narrower orbit about the equally extinct sun and at last fall into it. He says, I don't have the scientific proof to show that this is going to happen, but logic, dialectical logic is saying this is also inevitable. Everything that has life also has a death. The earth has a life, it will also have a death. And in this way, but he leaves a note of optimism. One second. He leaves a note of optimism. He says, the eternally repeated succession of worlds in infinite time is only the logical complement to the coexistence of innumerable worlds in infinite space. So just as the earth is destroyed today in the eternal cycle, tomorrow another earth, another kind of life will inevitably come about. And I conclude with this paragraph, beautiful paragraph. He says, it is an eternal cycle in which matter moves. A cycle that certainly only completes its orbit in periods of time for which our terrestrial year is no adequate measure. A cycle in which the time of highest development, the time of organic life, and still more that of the life of beings conscious of nature and of themselves, is just as narrowly restricted as the space in which life and self-consciousness come into operation. A cycle in which every finite mode of existence of matter, whether it be the sun or nebula vapor or single animals or genus of animals, chemical combinations or dissociations, is equally transient, and wherein nothing is eternal, but eternally changing, eternally moving matter, and the laws according to which it moves and changes. But however often and however relentlessly the cycle is completed in time and space, however many millions of suns and earths may arise and pass away, however long it may last before the conditions for organic life develop, however innumerable the organic beings that have to arise and to pass away before animals with a brain capable of thought are developed from their midst, and for a short span of time find conditions suitable for life, only to be exterminated later without mercy, we have the certainty that matter remains eternally the same in all its transformations, that none of its attributes can ever be lost, and therefore also that with the same iron necessity that it will exterminate on earth its highest creation, the thinking mind, it must somewhere else and at another time again produce it. So life will come about again in the future, even if it is destroyed, which it inevitably will be on this earth.